Hello, my name is Dan Gibson, and this is video number 2 on the subject of evidence suppressed. In the first video, we explored the Umayyad Inquisition led by Hajjaj bin Yusuf, who was the governor of Iraq, the Hejaz, Yamama, and Yemen, basically the eastern half of the Islamic Empire, between the time of 80 after the Hijrah and 95 after the Hijrah. We noted that he persecuted the old-school Muslims, especially the companions of the prophets. He silenced their objections, and some he had killed outright. By the end of his reign of terror, all objections to the religious reforms that took place during the time of the Umayyads, they had been accepted, or those that argued against them had been either subjected or eliminated. While Islam appeared to be one cohesive religion on the outside, those with objections went underground. It's during this second century of Islamic history that we come across teachers known as the hidden imams. These were teachers who claimed special knowledge and special teachings that were other than what the rest of Islam accepted. All of these imams were Muslims. At least they all claimed Muhammad is their prophet and the Quran is their scripture. For example, one of these is Imam Wafi Ahmad. He began writing down his teachings, which were then added to by other imams, often in secret. During the next 100 years of Islam, there were two major developments that we want to think about. The first was the development of Bayt al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. It was a drawing place for those who wanted to explore the sciences. And there was a burst of research and knowledge in many fields, especially mathematics and astronomy and medicine and so forth. But within Bayt al-Hikmah were various different influences. The ruling Abbasids had a strong interest in controlling what was going on in the research that was taking place there. But there were also these secret teachers and imams who were influential in speaking to others. So during the 2nd century, these hidden imams introduced some esoteric, cultic, and magic investigations. There was also a tension that grew between them and the caliphs at the time. There were those who wanted to protect what Islam was, and there were those who wanted to explore new things. It's during this time that the roots of groups such as the Ismailis, the Sufis, and the Qarmatians, they were developed. Now their roots are obscure because they themselves were obscure groups, especially at the beginning, and they were not looked on with favor by the ruling caliphs. At the beginning, these groups were more like secret sects, with secret knowledge and rites. By 300 after the Hijrah, the Abbasids were alarmed to learn how widespread these groups were. When capturing and torturing their members, they discovered that they had books, training manuals, and these had strange illustrations in them with curious diagrams. And what alarmed the Abbasids is that the members of these secret sects were studying these textbooks in a progression. And when they learned one manuscript, then they would move on and learn a second manuscript, written by anonymous teachers. So they could not peg down the source of these groups. Eventually, the Abbasids discovered 51 autonomously authored epistles, known as the Rasail of the Ikhwan al-Safa, brethren, the letters of the Brethren of Purity. These were sometimes found as single letters, and sometimes they were bound into 4 volumes. They contained philosophy, theology, cosmogony, and much more. There was even a mention of a 5th volume, which was deliberately not included with the 4 volumes. The 5th volume was intended only for those who had mastered the earlier material, and it was said to bring together everything and make everything clear. The students of these secret societies were classified into 4 different groups. The craftsmen. Now, a craftsman had to be at least 15 years of age, and they were known as the pious and the compassionate. So that's what you got to add to your name. You were so-and-so, the pious and the compassionate. Second were the political leaders. A political leader had to be at least 30 years of age. He was known as the good and the excellent. Next were a group called the kings. The king had to be at least 40 years of age, and they were known as the excellent and the noble. The highest order were the prophets and the philosophers. To become a prophet or a philosopher, a man had to be at least 50 years of age, and at that point he was considered equal to Jesus or Socrates or Muhammad. This rank was known as the angelic rank. These groups did not speak openly, not even to each other. Instead, they used allegory, such as animal stories, to speak about themselves and their relationship to opposing political and religious powers. In some cases, secret names were used, such as Pharaoh or Haman or others, to identify people in power. Dating the source of these writings is not a simple task, but by 300 after the Hijrah, one group had grown in size and had become widespread, with centers of concentration in Kufa and in the Sawad. That's the area of Saudi that has black fertile soil. Some of them had spread down into Yemen and were starting groups of students there. These were known as the followers of a man, Qarmat was his name, Hamdan Qarmat, and Hamdan's followers were named Qarmatians or Qarmati, men of Qarmat. This is where we get the word Qarmatians from. Back in 300 after the Hijrah, they were especially concentrated in an area that was known as al-Bahrain. Today, most outsiders associate the name Bahrain with a small island country in the Persian Gulf, but originally the name was used for a much wider area, especially the Sawad, the dark soil in Saudi Arabia. The earliest datable reference to the hidden teachers is mentioned, a mathematician, al-Hajjaj, who died in 238 after the Hijrah. Now, some historians place the creation of these 51 epistles at a later date. Some even try to push it to a century later. The opinion of the translator of the book that I've been reading, and that is the Qarmatians, From Concept to State by Muhammad al-Khalifa. And the translator there is Dr. Abdullah Lux. He seems to be in favor of a much earlier date. What is obvious to me is that by 301 after the Hijrah, when the leader of this group, Ibn Mansur al-Hajjaj, was imprisoned, the movement was in full vigor. The 51 epistles contained wisdom from Muslim background, from Greek, Persian, Indian, Jewish, Christian, Gnostics, all different kinds, Zoroastrians and Chaldean sources, all different wisdom had been brought together. But the 51 epistles were not the only source material that was used. In 1980, other works were discovered, such as Abdan's Shajarat al-Yaqin. This is the Tree of Certainty. With its discovery, more material was available to scholars who were studying the area and the teachings. But Volume 5 of the Rasail al-Ikhwan al-Safa have never been found. Some historians think that it was only an index to earlier materials, but others think it was the final, ultimate culmination of the secret teaching, meant only for the very highest level, and thus few of them were made. These secret societies thought in terms of two levels of Islamic religion. The first was a prerequisite for the second. So first people became Muslims and they followed the Prophet Muhammad and his Sunnah. The second level was a philosophical level that was known as faith or iman. This second level was not to be attempted unless you were an excellent, pious Muslim. The second level was seen as a spiritual level. Even though their physical bodies were present in this physical space here on earth, their minds and their spirits were becoming aware of the spiritual unseen things. So the Abbasid rulers were seen as temporal rulers, living in what the epistle called Jahannam, or the hell on earth. This term came from the Hebrew term Jahannam, which is in the Hebrew language. So The conflict between the Abbasids and the followers of the 51 epistles was based on a misunderstanding of what terms meant. The goals that they had were different. The Abbasids were concerned with ruling a physical Islamic empire. The followers of the 51 epistles were interested in attaining spiritual consciousness and academic abilities. But the Abbasids feared that they were becoming a political threat. So persecution began very early, despite the fact that the groups did not seek physical control, political control. It's my opinion that this persecution forced them later to use military force to help them establish their own place of security. Now, in this video, we want to highlight the teachings and the followings of Hamdan Qarmat, who was initially an Ismaili missionary. He started out that way, but then he developed his own movement known as the Qarmatians. And among themselves, they were known as the Brethren of Purity. The earliest book written against their teaching is as early as 260 after the Hijrah, and already this teaching was well established. Hamdan's followers were guided by traveling teachers and agents as they traveled around. They offered secret wisdom to those who would follow, and they were particularly attractive to the masses. You see, higher education was available to the elite. While most Muslims learned to read and write in their own little schools, higher education was out of their reach because you had to find teachers and you had to pay to attend. The secret societies offered a different route. As long as they could read, they could start their way through the 51 epistles. Once they had mastered one, then they would move on to the second and so forth through the whole 51. When they started studying, they were already given special honor. They were known as craftsmen, the first level, and the people added the pious and the compassionate to their name. So for outsiders, it sounded like a nice title, but to insiders, they understood immediately what level the person was at in this teaching. As their teachers traveled around, they found willing students. To qualify, they had to be pious Muslims who could read and write. Then they could start on their education without leaving their jobs. They could continue to earn their living, but at the same time, they had access to education. It was even a source of pride that they would be known by their low-class occupation. For example, Abdan, the chief missionary and the right-hand man of Hamdan Qarmat, he was known as the tiller and the ox herder. What made this especially charming is that these simple shepherds and tillers and herdsmen and local shopkeepers could quote from Socrates or Galen or Plato and other well-known ancient writers. They had a grasp of mathematics and astronomy and geography and history and much more. Imagine a young teenager being introduced to this secret society and learning that the man he bought his spices from in the market was actually a scholar, able to converse and discuss a wide variety of academic topics. And he too, as a teenager, if he aspired, he could climb the ladder of knowledge and power. And some did. Even Queen Aura of the Sulayhad dynasty reached the highest rank possible. But there's also a price to pay. The missionaries collected a 1/5 tax from their converts. These funds allowed the group to grow in power. While their identities remained a secret, their leaders, such as Hamdan, were able to pursue their own policies. Eventually, in 266 after the Hijrah, Hamdan's followers were so large that he could make overtures for an alliance with the Zanj. That was a secular rebellion that was going on. And even though they were repulsed, he claimed and he offered 100,000 fighting men of the Qarmatians. In 277 after the Hijrah, a fortified refuge, Dar al-Hajjaj, was established, a place for people. It was near Kufa, where they had a community of their own that was safe. The early Ismailis and the Qarmatians were focused on self-discipline and asceticism with the goal of possessing secret knowledge and gaining spiritual levels. So their focus wasn't on establishing a physical kingdom, but persecution led them to seeking places of refuge. which they called Dar al-Hijra, the House of Immigration, based on the idea of the first Muslims finding security in Medina. In their thinking, these were more like ideal city-states rather than break-off states. Perhaps today we would, in our modern thinking, might think of communes or esoteric communities. Now, the center of the Qarmatians was in Jaltha. It was at the Al-Aqsa Oasis in Saudi Arabia, and so Al-Aqsa Oasis was the home for the core leadership and where the teaching emanated from, although the Qarmatians were found in many places as far away as pockets in Yemen. Now, our knowledge of the Qarmatians is very limited, and things are still coming to light today. For instance, as I said, in 1980, a very early manuscript was found in Damascus in possession of an old Syrian Ismaili family. That manuscript was titled the Shajarat al-Yaqin, or of Abdan, and so it was the Tree of Certainty. And there were other manuscripts were found at the time, and it has been growing as different manuscripts come along. But none of them talk about their own history, who their group is, and it's just teaching for people in the group, but it doesn't describe to us these groups. Now, what's interesting to note is that during these years, the caliphs sought to suppress not only the earlier accounts of Islam, such as the Petra Qibla, but also there was an emphasis by the Arabs to erase Persian identity and language, replacing it with Arabic. Along with this, the caliphs suppressed the teachings of the Zoroaster and of Mazdak and others. Now, the Persians were slow to adopt the Arabic language, and there was some resistance to using Arabic, but slowly over time they submitted to the religion of Islam. So the teachings of Zoroaster and of Mazdak were forced underground. Eventually, these various underground teachings, such as Zoroaster, would come together and make a strange mixture with the Qarmatians and their secret teachings. Because their teachings were secret, there was conflicting report about the Qarmatians. Were they some kind of Islamic sect? Were they apostates from Islam? We only have the records and the writings of people from the outside. Al-Malti, who claimed that by their prayers and fastings weren't mandatory from them. But Baghdadi claimed that they once they knew the rituals, they didn't have to do them. Al-Ghazali says that he heard that to become a Qarmatian, one had to perform 30 Hajjas. Al-Tabari only mentions the differences in bathing rituals. And Makurazi, he is a Shiite chronicler. He's much kinder. He calls them the defenders of Allah's religion. Some felt that the Qarmatians were a legitimate sect of Islam. Others said they are apostates. There are some who claim that the Qarmatians were Ismailis, but I personally don't think this is the case. They had very similar roots, but the Qarmatians practiced a form of common property. And so when they established a village, it was academic and a religious commune rather than the villages we know today. These were located in the agricultural areas, and these communities were sometimes very prosperous. They were in an area called Sawad, which means the black land or the tillable land, a farming area as opposed to land that was for grazing animals. Due to the knowledge they gained from the 51 epistles, their teachers and their way of life appealed to those with a bent towards philosophy or pursuing some unique knowledge. This, however, brought accusations against them by outsiders who thought they were mixing Greek philosophy and astrology with Islam. Others claimed that they were Sabians or Majus or Jews or free-thinking atheists. Today, many historians feel that these were totally unjustified accusations, based on the fact that their epistles did quote some materials from these writers, but that they weren't embracing all the writings of everyone. So in the end, we have only a couple of sources of information. We have some of the epistles and the teaching materials, and we have the records of those who were opposed to them, often with derogatory comments and thoughts. I would like to suggest that the Qarmatians, their thoughts and their thinking evolved over time. Originally, the emphasis was on adding special wisdom to the pious and devout Muslims. Those writing about them, but without a great deal of first-hand knowledge, often confuse them with the Ismailis. And this is a common notion that is in some circles today. There are also confusion that's out there about confusing them with the Seveners, who thought that the seventh Mahdi had gone into hiding. The reason for such confusion is that the Qarmatians were a secretive people. So today we can only guess at some of their teachings. At the same time, we must accept that their teaching may have developed or evolved and changed over their 200 years of existence. If we had a complete set of their teaching manuals, we might be able to know a great deal more, but today's scholars must include many guesses and assumptions when reporting about the Qarmatians. For instance, what was in Volume 5? Was it merely an index of earlier teaching, or did it include the ultimate secret teachings that only the very advanced were trusted with? Why would an index be needed? Because people worked through these. The initiates started with the first epistle, and they slowly worked their way through, memorizing and learning until they got to the 51st epistle. And since they had spent so many years working through them, why would they need an index? These 51 epistles were only for the eyes of the secret society, and they were only revealed when one level was done and they could move on to the next level. So what was in the last level? Remember, the highest order of followers were called the prophets and the philosophers. A man had to be at least 50 years old, and he was considered equal to Jesus and Socrates and Muhammad. Only those who reached this high status were allowed to even see Volume 5 with its deepest secrets. This would be knowledge that was kept by the smallest, most powerful members of the society. But in time, their numbers grew as more people rose up through the levels, finally reaching prophet and philosophers. And then the secret knowledge became more widespread as more people were aware. It would have been the result of several things coming together here. So now we have to consider Islamic history. Keep in mind, up until now, modern scholars did not know about the Petra Qibla. They didn't read this information into this material. I am coming along for the first time considering what was in the 5th volume, what might have been there. And now I believe we can understand the actions of the Qarmatians later on. First, Abu Tahir, Suleiman al-Janabi, he was a Qarmatian leader known as Abu Tahir. He began to speak out against the pilgrimage to Mecca. Remember, the Qarmatians believed that they were the true followers of Islam. They were the brethren of purity, referring to the purity of Islam. They prayed more, they pilgrimaged more, they gave more than the other Muslim groups. They willingly paid taxes to the caliph, and they paid taxes to their own leaders. They were very pious Muslims. They held to the main tenets of Islam. The only difference is they sought higher knowledge in this area of secret teachings. These teachings did not negate Islam, but they believed they enhanced Islam. So when Abu Tahir began to speak against the pilgrimage, the Qarmatians saw it as purifying Islam. This was their ultimate goal. At first, it began with the Qarmatians forcibly trying to stop pilgrims from going on pilgrimage to Mecca. The object of their stopping the pilgrims doesn't seem to be material gain. They didn't just tax them and let them go on. They forcibly tried to turn them back. If their object had been taxation, they would not have resorted to killing and stopping pilgrims. They would have just taxed them and then let them go on. In about the year 293 after the Hijrah, a leader known as Zechariah, he was a missionary. He was sent out and he was going, first of all, to Syria. The missionaries there ended up in a physical battle. and they attacked several towns, including Damascus. They pillaged everywhere they went, and so the Abbasid army was called out against them. And after a brief battle in which Abu Ghanam was killed, an amnesty was declared. Now, this is the first sort of real military action that took place. This same missionary, he appealed to the Syrian supporters and informed them of the imminent appearance of the Mahdi. So soon afterwards, the Qarmatian tribesmen of Syria joined with him and his followers, and they made a surprise attack on Kufa. But they were driven out. The Qarmatians then defeated the Abbasid army that was sent after them. It's at this point that they began to stop the caravans of the Persian pilgrims returning from Mecca, arguing with them, and then they resisted. And when there was a resistance, then they ended up massacring them. This confrontation of pilgrims continued on all the way to the year 294. Then, when they were unsuccessful at stopping the pilgrims, their new leader, Abu Tahir, took an army with him, and he attacked the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. First of all, they said that they had come on a pilgrimage, and then when the city opened up to them, they entered it and they began to destroy. Now, this is not the action of people trying to get money. It's the action of people who are convinced that the city of Mecca is false. These Qarmatians were on a mission to purge and purify Islam, and so they killed many pilgrims. They killed people, left them in the street. Many were stuffed down Zamzam well. They were convinced Zamzam well was not the true well. These pious, dedicated Muslims set about destroying the city, convinced that they were acting on behalf of Allah and they were protecting the true faith. This is not the action of men seeking taxes or wealth. They were completely convinced that the pilgrimage to Mecca was anti-Islamic. These were men who considered themselves first Muslims, completely committed to Islam and to the Quran and to the Prophet Muhammad. And yet they felt justified to attack the holy city of Mecca, killing pilgrims, desecrating the well of Zamzam. In the end, they removed the black stone, and they took it with them, leaving the city behind, desecrated with dead bodies lying in the street. Whatever secrets were contained in Volume 5 had set them aflame. It was obviously more than just an index. Having taken the black stone, Abu Tahir and his army returned back to their communes in Greater Bahrain. Here the black stone was placed in storage. No one came to pray. No one sent word that they wanted money for it. It was not used as a bargaining chip, as some suggest. It simply passed out of circulation for 21 years. Attempts by the Abbasids and the Fatimids to bargain for the return of the Black Rock were rejected. Abu Tahir was so convinced that the black stone had become an idol and a snare for the Muslims, that there were reports that he went out and urinated on the black stone every day. It was during this 21-year period that something sad and strange took place. Abu Tahir first conquered Oman. That was in 318 after the Hijrah. He became master pretty well of all of Arabia. And at this point, he felt he was preparing the way for the seventh Mahdi to return. And so he recognized special abilities in a young Persian man, and who he felt was the long-expected Mahdi. So in 319, after the Hijrah, this young man became the caliph. And a strange thing took place. Instead of revealing the truth behind all previous religions, this young man, who claimed descent from the Persian kings and he started talking anti-Arab stuff. And he turned out to be a restorer of the old Persian religion. He restored the worship of fire and the cursing of all the earlier prophets. He also insulted a number of ceremonies that shocked the Qarmatians. This greatly upset the Abbasid Caliph, who ordered the execution of the chief priest of the Zoroastrians at that time. When the new Mahdi began to execute the leading Qarmatians of Bahrain, Abu Tahir had him killed and admitted He had been an imposter who had tricked his way in. This episode seriously demoralized the Qarmatians of Bahrain. It weakened their influence over the Qarmatian community in the east. At this point, many Qarmatians left Bahrain and joined with the armies of various anti-Qarmatian rulers. However, the Qarmatians continued to hold sway over a large area of land, and there were even secret followers throughout the empire, some even in the army of the Caliph. It was not until 322 when a pact between the Abbasid caliphs and Abu Tahrir was concluded. The Qarmatians agreed not to attack and discourage pilgrims going to Mecca, but Abu Tahrir refused to return the Black Stone. The next year, the Qarmatians resumed their attacks on the pilgrims. Then in 326, the Caliph was able to secure the safe passage of pilgrims in exchange for 35,000 dinars, paid from the common treasury. And an individual tax was put on each Hajj pilgrim. Eventually, in 332, Abu Tahrir died of smallpox, and the rule of the Qarmatians was divided between his two brothers. At this time, the Black Stone was transported over to Kufa and placed in the Friday Mosque so that people could see it. Sinbar bin al-Hassan bin Sanbar eventually returned the Black Stone to Mecca, and he reinstalled it in its place, and he said, "We took it by the command of Allah, and we returned it by His will." What is peculiar is that the Black Stone, which had remained neglected in the Qarmatian capital for a period of 22 years, was returned voluntarily. The Qarmatians had rejected all previous offers of money that had been made for the stone. For instance, Ibn al-Athir mentions that someone was sent to them with an offer of 50,000 gold dinars if they would return it. But they did not answer him, and he went away. That's the emissary. He went away, went back with nothing. Following this, the Qarmatian state slowly declined. Following the death of their leader in 449 after the Hijrah, internal squabbles reduced their influence substantially. In the end, the Qarmatians just disappear into obscurity, and it's not recorded what happened to them. It is believed that when the Black Stone was returned, that it had been smashed into 7 pieces. And if you look in Mecca today, you will see the 7 pieces of the Black Stone. What really happened long ago with the Qarmatians is hard to explain, and many scholars have tried many different explanations over the years trying to explain what the Qarmatians were thinking. But I believe that once you understand the history of Islam, and once you see the Petra as the first Qibla, you can suddenly understand the Qarmatians and their resistance to the pilgrimage to Mecca, their resistance to Mecca as being a holy city, their resistance to Zamzam being the actual real Zamzam, the holy well, and their resistance to the Black Stone. And so that explains to me very clearly, for my own thinking, who the Qarmatians were. Other people reading through this history who are now going to have to decide, did the Petra Qibla have anything to do with the Qarmatians? We're not told because we don't have that information. And so I would like to suggest that the Qarmatians were the last of those. They were this secret sect with their secret teachings, and I believe in that secret teaching was something that alerted them to the fact that the real Qibla was not Mecca in Saudi Arabia. I think that young Mahdi, who really got them, praying towards fire and making the Qibla fire, as the Zoroastrians said, he's the one who actually destroyed those whole idea of returning the Black Rock or doing something with it. And so it all passed away, and Islam became back to the traditional understanding that was held by the caliphs and that has come down to us today. And it wasn't until archaeologists and historians began piecing together bits and pieces of the puzzle and looking at satellite images and realizing that the first Qiblas of the first mosques faced the city of Petra, which I believe was also known at that time as Mecca. And once that happened, then the cat was out of the bag, as we say. Something was taking place, and people began to look and to see, what does all of this mean? And I think our last little bit of evidence, and this will bring to a conclusion our video series, Archaeology in Islam. And at this point then, we just go back into traditional Islamic history up until the current age. I will still be doing some other videos. I want to do a few videos on navigation and how the Arabs did navigation and how they set their qiblas. And I would also want to still do a few question and answer videos. And so I appreciate those of you who have sent in. Again, I'm up to about 100 different emails waiting on my computer, so I apologize if I haven't answered you in the last 2 or 3 months. It's just because so many keep coming in, and I do answer as many as I can, but they just keep building up, and so hopefully I'll be able to answer some of those. So thank you for enduring through this whole series of, I think it's 28 videos now, and trust that you've enjoyed it, and maybe someday we can find out a way of putting all this information together, maybe in a book or maybe in another film, I'm not sure, and then people can see all the information together. For now, they have to wade through this whole series of archaeology in Islam. Thank you. I'm Dan Gibson, and this is the final video of this series.